Greetings and welcome to the second dev diary for Legends Ember. And today we're going to just pretty much give an off-the-cuff, slightly rambling account of what I've been working on at the moment. And it's going to be generally centered around the idea of character control, of how players and indeed the DM interact with the game through their characters, and what the implications for design are, what the implications for the look and the feel of the game, and really sort of the whole thing, the whole package. I mean, maybe that's a bit optimistic of me because, frankly, without a script, I'm likely to start rambling and I might have to cut large sections out. So I apologize in advance if there are sudden cuts. So here we are in the game engine. The game is built in Unity. One of the big 2 or 3 game engines. Obviously, you got Unreal, Godot, a few other ones. The eagle-eyed amongst you may well be able to see that the project here is called UnderQuest. This is like my internal code name for Legends Ember, but also it's basically what the project was called many years ago when I first created this project, and I first created the idea of what would ultimately become Legends Ember. And at the time, it was perhaps somewhat derivatively based on the name, a sort of hero quest for VR. This was if you want the sort of the one-line pitch, hero quest in VR. Interestingly, Demio, whatever it's called, which was released recently, is effectively hero quest in VR and has done very well. So apparently it was a good idea. So in UnderQuest, which you would play in VR, and you would have effectively a hero quest like modular board that would get built out. Thinking advanced hero quest rather than classic hero quest. For those of you in the know, those of you old enough to remember hero quest and indeed advanced hero quest and the various expansions. At that time, the way you would control your character, I had in my mind, is you would pick the model up physically in VR. You would have your VR hand, you'd pick the model up physically in VR and put it down where you wanted to go. And that's the way they do it in Demio. And I abandoned that idea fairly early on because although it's nice in theory, I think in practice, and I think Demio demonstrates this, it's a bit fiddly. And actually, the reason you do that when you're playing a physical game, a tabletop game, is because you have to. That's the only way to interact with a model in the real world, right? Unless you've got some kind of, I don't know, hyper-advanced robot model that can respond to your commands, or it's like a holodesk or something. But, in reality, you're playing with little plastic models. The only way to move it from one place to another on the board is to pick it up and put it down somewhere else. So that's what you do. Emulating that in an environment where you don't have to do that seems a bit backwards to me. It seems like, well, okay, you can just tell this model where you want it to go and it can go there on its own. You don't need to physically pick it up and put it down. Interestingly, for a while, the way it would work is you would pick your model up, but you would sort of pick up a ghost version of your model. You would then put that ghost version down where you wanted it to go, and then it would trace a path to get there. And this was all done with squares. So the world was divided up into little squares, again, a bit like Demio. And of course, classic tabletop games like Hero Quest, and then it would go and move. And why are you doing that? Why are you picking up the model and putting it down again? Why don't you just use a laser pointer or something to say where you want to move your model to? Anyway, that was the very first version of what has become Legends Ember. The clock moves forward, the pandemic hits, and we need somewhere to continue our role playing. And I've got this project, I've got UnderQuest, it's in a fairly advanced state, it does a lot of the stuff that you would need to do to be able to just present a virtual tabletop to the players. Obviously I convert it to a 2D project because I'm the only one with VR, because my D&D friends are losers. Hey losers. Anyway, obviously if you don't have VR, you're not a loser. It's fine. You haven't realized the truth and the joy and the glory as yet. And also, whilst I'm talking about this, exclusive Legends Ember will have a VR version. You will be able to play Legends Ember in VR, but I'm not ready to talk about that yet. So, pandemic hits, Legends Ember becomes effectively the platform for me to do my weekly role-playing in with my D&D group, or at least that's the theory. Takes a little while before it gets there. In the meantime, we used Tabletop Simulator for quite a long time. And of course, it inherits all of the elements that UnderQuest had. So it was a grid-based layout, again, very much like we would do when we played, in person. We had a board and, the sections were always, I got a 3D printer, so for about a year or so before the pandemic hit, I was able to print out 3D scenery and terrain, and even before that we had battle mats and things like that. So we were very used to playing. When you engaged in a battle, when you had an encounter, there would be a battle map, and it would be broken up into squares, and you move your models around and fight it out on the tabletop. So it seemed like the obvious way to do it when implementing it on the computer. And if you look at most CRPGs, at least most really tabletop RPG inspired CRPGs, so your classic things like Baldur's Gate or Planescape Tournament or Divinity Original Sins 1 and 2, Baldur's Gate 3, some of them do away with the squares. A lot of them do away with the squares, to be fair, but they still follow that effectively. It's almost like a tabletop view. You're looking down at a tabletop and you click to say where you want your character to move to, and he moves there, and that's it. So Legends Ember continued to follow this sort of pattern for quite a long time. First of all, I dropped the grid because I thought, with Legends Ember, I want the DM to just be able to throw stuff down, and that's the world. I don't want them to have to think these have to connect to each other, these squares have to connect to each other. The game has to understand with any given thing, any given bit of terrain that you're on, where you can walk and where you can't. I want it literally to be, if you want to put a table down, you can walk on the table. If you flip the table over, it becomes a wall and you can't walk through the table. And that's, that's very doable, and indeed that is the way it is worked. But it meant that I needed a fairly generalistic approach to deciding when I was projecting the grid onto the world, how the squares connected to each other and whether you could walk to each other. And that was all fine. But I decided perhaps I was too wedded to this idea of the grid. So I ditched the grid experimentally and really liked it, because I eliminated a whole tier of complexity in how you projected those grid squares onto the world. Because if you think about it, it was fine. Say if a building was aligned to those grid squares, then you could have it nicely shaped and sized to fit with precise grid squares inside it. But if you decide you want to cant that building to the side, if you want to rotate it 25 degrees or something, then suddenly you've got all these awkward partial squares inside. You're never properly aligned unless you realign the grid to the building, and then you've got these effectively misaligned grids all trying to connect together. So ditching the grid just seemed like the sensible thing to do, and having experimented with it, I'm convinced it was the right thing to do. It made the project simpler, it removed a level of abstraction and issues, and it doesn't really make it any harder for the players to understand. But more important than that, at that point it was still played in this overhead view, and in many respects it would have been similar to Divinity Original Sins 1 and 2 or Baldur's Gate 3, where you can move wherever you want, you click to move wherever you want, you'll nav there, and that's that. And then you play it from this tabletop-esque perspective, tell the thing what you want to attack, and we played a good few sessions like that. It was like that for probably a few months, and it works well. Obviously, it works well. Baldur's Gate 3 does it. It's a very well-defined, it's a very well-established trope. People are very familiar with it. And then I just the whole point of creating my own project, the whole point of doing something with Legends Ember was to leverage the ability of a PC to do things you can't do on the tabletop, Sooner or later, the pandemic will be over and we can go back to playing on the tabletop if we want to play on the tabletop. What makes the video game experience or the virtual environment experience stand out is that you can do things that you simply cannot do on the desktop. And one of those things was, I reasoned, actually inhabit your character, go right down into an over-the-shoulder perspective on your character, or indeed a first-person perspective on your character. So I implemented it. It was easy enough to do. To just allow the players to toggle their camera down into their character's view to see what they liked it. And frankly, it was a bit of a revelation. People loved it. I mean, the guys, they loved it. And the first time they got to use it, there was some awkwardness because at the time they couldn't control their characters directly. They still had to click where they wanted to go. So they had to, look around the scene, click where they wanted to go. That would put the nav line down, then they could nav and move off to that point. But people really liked it. And so, from there I decided effectively to move entirely in that direction and embrace the direct control of your character. So I implemented, traditional WASD first person or third person action controls effectively. But I was still doing it on the existing nav mesh. It was still kind of tied to it. It had a very simplistic character controller, which brings me to today, where the thing that has changed most since the last time I ran an alpha session, and the next alpha session is this Wednesday. The last time I ran an alpha session, ignore the purple smoke, the character controllers were still on a nav mesh. So you were effectively tied to the nav mesh. The nav mesh was generated at the scene load, which was a little bit awkward, especially on older computers. And you just sort of moved around, and it was very simplistic. I've implemented a proper character controller now, and you can't really tell, apart from the fact that it's going to be a bit smoother, and the animations are going to be a bit smoother, they're going to work a bit smoother. It's really dark here. Hold on, let me switch to Zangief here, because he's got a torch equipped, which is going to generate a bit of light. More importantly, what it allows me to do is I'm not tied to the nav mesh anymore. And in fact, I'm not actually using the nav mesh at all at the moment. And I've completely turned the nav mesh off, because I figure, why generate the nav mesh if the players are directly controlling their characters and the DM is directly controlling the NPCs? I've got no NPCs pathing on their own in the world at the moment, so I don't need a nav mesh. So I've turned it off to save the generation time. And that's fine. Ultimately, I will need a nav mesh type solution for things when the DM is not directly controlling characters. But when I implement that, I'm not going to use the built-in Unity nav mesh, because there doesn't appear to be any way. And Unity, on the off chance anyone from Unity watches this, I find this incredible, by the way. There is no way to serialize the information from a nav mesh. So the only way you can use a pre-existing nav, the only way you can pre-bake your nav mesh, is if you use a pre-built Unity scene which you've generated in the editor. Legends Ember doesn't use Unity scenes, because the whole point is that players can create their own scenes. People can just create a new environment and slap stuff down and create whatever scene they want and save that and then load it in for the players. And I can generate that nav mesh, you can generate that nav mesh as the scene is being built, as it's being edited, but you can't save it at all. There doesn't seem to be any way to save it. So you have to regenerate it every time the thing loads, even though you can clearly save it when it's part of a Unity scene. So God knows why it's like that. Apparently it is. From what I can see, there is no way to get around it. There's no way to feed in the mesh data for the nav mesh into the nav mesh and have it just reconstitute itself without rebuilding itself entirely. So sodja, Unity, I'll do it myself, or I'll find another off-the-shelf system that works better. Anyway, I don't need it at the moment, because we're not using nav meshes. We're literally just navigating around the scene. So the character controller now has a capsule collider on the character, and it collides with the ground. It does allow me to jump. Now I was gonna, and I may still implement just a basic jump, like a quick hop, but this is D&D, right? Or this is, I should get out of the habit of calling it D&D. I'll get into trouble. It's not D&D. This is an RPG. This is a tabletop-like RPG experience where you're going to have to roll for things. This whole character control business comes down to finding a balance between allowing the player to directly control their character, but not requiring the player to have the sort of twitch skills and is dependent on their skills and not on the character skills. This is still an RPG, right? You still want to be able to, play a 20-year-old monk, even if you're a 75-year-old with arthritic fingers. So, but jumping. I want to jump. I can press space. I can bring up my jump marker, and this basically shows me the jump that I'm going to make, and then you can just sort of click to actually complete the jump. So it sort of takes away that guesswork element. Of course, you still want dice rolling in a game like this. So the way this will ultimately work, and it's not quite implemented yet, but when you bring up your jump indicator, it'll be green up to a certain distance. And this is actually based on the forces that are required to complete this jump. So this indicator is actually calculating the force that would need to be applied to the character controller in order to propel it on that arc. And the force that you're able to generate on your character will be dependent on your strength, which is the way it works in D&D, or indeed this standard reference design or standard reference document or whatever it is that it's called that D&D is based on and Legends Ember will be based on. So the amount of force you'll be able to generate will be based on your strength, and that will basically give you a sort of maximum distance that you can jump without having to make any sort of roll. And then if you try and jump beyond that, this little indicator will turn orange and then red to indicate either the jump is impossible or it's possible, but it'll require a roll. And then when you click the button, it'll spawn a d20, and you'll be able to roll like your acrobatics or your athletics check, and then depending on the result of the roll, if it beats the target DC that the game has decided for the level of force you're trying to achieve with your jump, then it'll give you that full impetus. And if it doesn't, if it falls short, then the amount of impetus will fall short and your jump will fall short, so potentially you might not make it. And this has had me thinking a lot about how much control do I want the players to have over their characters. If you have almost no control and you do everything on a grid, say, you do it like a virtual tabletop, you've got a little icon on a grid, then anything you want to do which the game doesn't explicitly include, that the game doesn't explicitly endow your character controller with the ability to do, you can just DM it. You can just say, like it happened last week. So one of the characters had come down here into the little crypty area, come into this room right here, and it's a bit dark in here. Let me just be able to see. So yeah, they come in here. There's this little guy up here, right? This is Keeper Hendrick, who had been who's dead. He's dead. He's just a dead guy hanging off the thing. But obviously the player wanted to get up there, right? He wanted to get up there, and there's no climbing in Legends Ember at the moment. At least there's no built-in climbing. So as the DM, I was able to just enter my free cam view here, scroll on up, get my character, and just move him up there. Boom. There he is. And that's fine. And you can do that. And I just said, okay, you make a roll to climb. He makes his roll to climb. If he had failed his roll to climb, I wouldn't have put him up there. If he succeeds his roll to climb, you put him up there. You don't actually need to go through the process of climbing up the wall. And that's fine. Good even, because you could do anything you wanted with that, right? I mean, you can, it doesn't have to be this sort of like short distance here. It can be a whole thing. It could be, what you can't really do at the moment is I couldn't put him halfway up the wall. And that's where this kind of question of how much do you implement and how much do you not implement. You could do the whole thing as a theatre of the mind thing, and you could just play out the scene of him climbing up, and then when you completed that climb, you could then either put him at the top or put him at the bottom if you've fallen back down again. But you couldn't put him halfway up unless your character controller actually includes climbing. So, do I include climbing on the character controller? I think the answer is yes, even though arguably this scene might have been harder to narrate at the time, because would the player just be able to run in here and go, oh, I see a wall, I want to climb up there, and without even asking the DM, he just goes, oh, I'm going to climb up there. That's a possibility. That's freedom, right? You just create an environment, you allow the player to interact with the environment, the control, to bring it back to the title of the video, the control of the character controller effectively defines what the player can do, and they require potentially limited input from the DM to do it. I think there's going to be a balancing act in that respect. And certainly the compromise there is to say you can climb, but the DM has to take control of your character to do it. So you can't just climb any surface, because that might just get a bit weird. But if you want to climb a surface, you run up to the surface and you say, I'd like to climb this surface. The DM makes you make a roll, and then the DM puts your character into climb mode, scales him up to a point on the surface and says, that's as far as your character's got. But it does raise this whole question of how much do I want the game to show you what's happening and to provide you with the in-game direct feedback, the immersive experience of playing it, versus how much do I want to retain of that tabletop, you can do anything you want because the DM can just make it up. They can just narrate what happens and present you with the results of that action. And it's a difficult one. It's one that I have not got a finished answer to yet. This is going to be an ongoing tug of war between, the desire to give complete freedom with the reality of, there are going to be just inherent limits to how much you can get a character controller to do. And, from a player's perspective, it's going to be frustrating if some things that they expect to be able to do constantly require DM approval or DM input. So, like movement, obviously you need to, as a DM, you need to be able to lock movement. You have to be able to sort of put the game into a narrative mode. But generally speaking, the players should have control over their character and should be able to decide where their character moves and what their character does, without constantly checking in with the DM. That's the point of doing it like this, and not having and not being on the tabletop, or indeed the theatre of the mind. So there you go. That's character control. I do have some animations that I got specifically to do this. Interestingly, I did get climbing. I've recently acquired climbing animations for climbing up and down. What I believe is called mantling, which is kind of where you hop over like a little low thing. It's not called mantling in the animation, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So these sorts of things, again, see, this is where a player arguably couldn't fail. It seems obtuse to require the DM input. Now, that is going to mean that, probably there's going to be situations where a player might be able to get somewhere the DM wasn't expecting them to get. These sorts of moves arguably should be just part of a character's regular repertoire, stepping up. I mean, you can already step up pretty high, but just like a nice big step up. But specifically these sorts of climbing animations, I think it's going to be important to let the player do stuff like this, where it's a full-on wall, where you want to go, I want to scale this wall. I think that's where the DM needs to have control. And when we're talking about the single-player game, and make no mistake, I spend at least as much time, if not more time, thinking about how this will work in single player, how this will work as a single player experience, as I do the multiplayer stuff. Arguably, the multiplayer stuff, when you're being run by a DM, you've got a lot of leeway there to let the DM fix up the issues, to effectively cover up the cracks and make things happen that you want to happen, or just narrate and then move on. Even though it didn't happen on screen, you just narrate that it happened and you move on, as you would do with a VTT. Single player is really where the trick is. That's where, the interface, the character controller is going to be much more important, because you're not going to have a human intelligence mitigating things then. You're going to have to rely on the systems, the game design and the systems, to allow the AI DM to moderate what happens. And I think for that, I've been playing a bit of Star Citizen recently, and I quite like their Inner Thought system. I don't know if you've ever played Star Citizen, but basically the Inner Thought system is they've got like an interact key. So you would hold the interact key, which sort of brings up your mouse pointer in Star Citizen, and you would get little floating text over things that you could interact with that had some kind of thing that you could do with them. So I'm thinking a system like that is probably a good idea. So in this instance, when you came in here, if you held your interact key, or maybe just by default, a wall that the game was expecting you to be able to climb would have a little climb interact on it, and you would be able to just go over, and then the AIDM would do the climb for you. So you wouldn't just be able to climb any wall you wanted, but walls that were intended to be climbable would have this interact on them. Are you flagging things that the player should be like free to discover themselves? I don't know that that's necessarily an issue, but it's something to be experimented with. So that's today's Dev Diary. It's been rambling. It's been weird. Am I going to be able to use this? I don't know. I'll see when I actually try and edit this together into something sensible. Character controllers and what you do with them. It's a big part of what is going to ultimately set Legends Ember apart. So that's it, really. That's all I want to talk about today. It's been a ramble. I hope this is all right. Please do leave a comment if you have any feedback about the things that I've been talking about today, or just the video, the quality of the video, or lack thereof. Leave a like, leave a dislike if I really screwed it up, so I know not to do things like this again. And subscribe if you want to keep updated, and all of that stuff that YouTubers ask you to do all the time. Marketing is, I wish you didn't have to do marketing. I wish you could just make this game and it would just magically be known by everyone. But sadly, that is not the case. So videos like this are a necessity. And if this looks interesting to you, if this seems like something that might be an exciting development in the world of RPGs and video games, please follow. Please let other people know. And yeah, I'll see you in the next Dev Diary. I have been Weird Wizard, aka Dave. And I'll see you later.